I found Captain Vasquez's final recording in the Prometheus archives, and I couldn't sleep for 3 nights after that. I just sat in the silence of the archival bay, trying to process what we, as humans, once did to an entire civilization without even meaning to. My name is Daniel Cross, an archivist for the Interstellar Historical Commission, and my job is to recover lost fragments of our past from the wreckage of old ships. Usually, it's boring logs, technical reports, cargo lists, nothing special. But when I decrypted the black box of the Prometheus, the legendary pioneer ship that vanished 5,000 years ago, I realized I wasn't just holding history. I was holding a sentence passed against all of humanity by the galaxy, and the reason we were locked inside the solar system for millennia like dangerous animals in a cage. The recording began with Vasquez's enthusiastic voice. She was describing first contact with the Kedara race, and there was such happiness and hope in her words that it felt physically painful, because I already knew how it would end. The Kedara were remarkable beings, collective minds that lived in total harmony with their planet. Every tree, every stream, every living creature was part of one massive consciousness. Earthlings landed on their world with open hearts, bringing gifts and samples of our culture, and the Kedara welcomed us like long-awaited guests. The first 2 days were an incredible cultural exchange. Humans learned to understand their way of communicating through bioelectric impulses, while the Kedara studied our technology with childlike curiosity. But on the 3rd day, something went wrong. Vasquez recorded that the locals began showing strange symptoms. Their connection to one another started to break, as if someone were jamming a radio signal. By the end of the week, the Kedara planet had turned into a graveyard. 12 billion sentient beings died from common Earth bacteria that were harmless to us, but proved to be an absolute plague for them, as their immune systems had never encountered anything like it in millions of years of evolution in an isolated ecosystem. Vasquez recorded everything until the very last moment, and horror, despair, and guilt gradually built in her voice. She realized her crew had caused a genocide unintentionally, simply because human bodies carried microorganisms we didn't even think about. Her final recording lasted only 20 seconds, and I still remember every word. She said that we were a plague, that humanity had always been a plague, and that the galaxy must never allow us to leave our system because we kill simply by existing. Immediately after that, another recording kicked in. The cold, mechanical voice of a representative from the Conclave, an intergalactic council of the eldest races, declaring humanity an Omega-class pathogen and initiating the Eternal Grave Protocol. A few hours later, an energy sphere began to deploy around the solar system, cutting us off from the rest of the universe for the next 5,000 years. When I finished listening to that recording, I sat in absolute silence, realizing that everything we were taught in school about the Great Quarantine was only half the truth. We were told the galaxy feared our aggression, our weapons, and our thirst for expansion. But the truth was far more terrifying and tragic. We weren't locked away for what we wanted to do, but for what we did out of ignorance, and that weight of guilt still rests on every one of us today. I was just an ordinary engineer on an orbital station when the sky began to go out. First, Alpha Centauri disappeared, then Sirius. Then, entire constellations were simply erased from sight, as if someone were turning off the stars one by one with a giant cosmic light switch. I was 28 years old, and I had just contacted my wife on Earth. We were planning to have a child after my return in 2 months, and suddenly, astronomers started screaming into the general comms channel that something impossible was happening. Some kind of structure was deploying around the entire solar system, an energy barrier of unimaginable scale that was literally folding space-time around us, cutting us off from the rest of the universe. In 6 hours, we lost 90% of the visible stars, and I remember standing at the viewport, staring into that black nothingness, swallowing the cosmos, thinking of only one thing. Would I make it back home before it covered us completely? Panic broke out when people on Earth saw their night sky go dark. I watched live broadcasts from the surface, and it was pure madness because, for the average person, the disappearance of the stars meant the end of the world in the most literal sense. Religious fanatics screamed about divine wrath. Scientists tried to explain the events as natural phenomena, and governments of every nation held emergency meetings, trying to figure out what to do when your civilization is suddenly locked in a giant cage of unknown origin. Riots started in major cities. People trashed stores, banks, and government buildings, because when the very foundation of reality collapses, all social contracts cease to matter. I tried calling my wife hour after hour, but the connection kept dropping due to network overloads, and every second of silence was worse than any nightmare. And then, over every city on Earth, over every station, and over every ship, a message appeared. Massive, glowing letters right in the atmosphere, in every language simultaneously, including those no one had spoken for 100 years. The voice was cold and completely emotionless. It announced that humanity had been declared a biological threat to the galactic community, and that we had been isolated within what they called the Tychosphere, an energy prison from which there was no escape. The most terrifying part wasn't the isolation itself, but the sentence they passed. They said they were granting us the mercy of a quick death, that in 200 years the air in the solar system would be depleted due to the disruption of natural cosmic processes, and that we should use this time to make peace with the inevitable. When the message ended, a silence fell over all communication channels like nothing I had ever heard. Even the panickers went quiet, because this wasn't just the end of the world. It was an official death sentence from godlike beings, and there was no way to appeal it. But something strange happened in the following days. Instead of mass suicides and the total collapse of civilization, humanity began to do what it does best. It began to stubbornly cling to life and look for ways to survive against the impossible. I returned to Earth a week later, found my wife alive, and together we watched as governments united, as scientists from all over the world gathered in laboratories, and as engineers began drafting plans to convert the entire solar system into a giant life support system. Someone suggested dismantling Mercury for solar panels. Someone else proposed terraforming Venus with nuclear bombs, and another suggested building biospheres on asteroids. They gave us 200 years until death, and we decided that would be enough time to prove one simple thing to the galaxy. You cannot kill a human being just by locking them in a cage, because we will turn that cage into a home, and then we will kick the door down and walk out to demand answers from those who dared to pass judgment on us. My great-grandfather worked on the dismantling of Mercury. My grandfather built atmospheric processors on Mars. My father designed megastructures around Jupiter, and I became one of the first researchers of the Tychosphere anomalies. And every one of us knew a simple truth from childhood, one that parents hammered into their children's heads for generation after generation. Out there, beyond that wall, are the beings who sentenced us to death. And our job is to survive long enough to one day walk out and ask them what the hell they were thinking. I was born 2,000 years after the barrier was erected on an orbital station above Venus, which by then was already being covered by its first oceans after 300 years of nuclear terraforming. From my childhood bedroom window, I could see thousands of cargo ships shuttling between planets, hauling resources from the dismantled Mercury to build new cities. The solar system had turned into one giant survival factory, where every stone, every drop of water, and every atom of matter was used with maximum efficiency. By the time I entered the university, humanity had long since crossed the death threshold assigned to us. Those 200 years had passed 15 centuries ago. The air didn't run out, the life support system worked flawlessly, and the population had grown to 300 billion people scattered across the solar system, from artificial cities in solar orbit to ice colonies on the moons of Neptune. The asteroid belt had been transformed into billions of automated factories managed by AI symbionts, which we created not as slaves, but as partners. After that incident with the Katara, We swore never again to underestimate the importance of symbiosis and mutual understanding with other forms of intelligence. Mars became humanity's second home, with an atmosphere, oceans, and forests grown from genetically modified Earth plants adapted to local conditions, and megastructures the size of small moons rose in orbit around Jupiter, research complexes where thousands of scientists worked toward a single goal. That goal was simple: to understand the Tychosphere and find a way to break it. This is where I found my calling, because it turned out the barrier wasn't just an energy wall. It was a fundamental distortion of space-time that created unique physical conditions within itself. We discovered that the laws of physics inside the sphere behaved strangely. Time flowed slightly faster than it should, gravitational constants differed slightly from the standard, and some quantum effects manifested much more strongly than usual. At first, this seemed like a curse. But then, someone proposed a brilliant idea. What if we use these anomalies as tools? For the next 500 years, we studied the prison we were locked in, taking it apart bolt by bolt at the quantum level, and gradually began to understand the principles of the technology created by races that had existed for millions of years. We stole knowledge from our own cage and turned it into weapons, engines, and tools. By my 40th birthday, humanity had reached a technological level that, by our estimates, matched or even exceeded the level of those who had locked us away. We learned to manipulate space-time, created ships capable of existing in folded dimensions, developed biotechnologies that made our bodies resistant to virtually any pathogen, and most importantly, we understood how the Tychosphere worked at a fundamental level. Every evening, I stood at the viewing panel of my laboratory, looking at that shimmering barrier encircling the entire system, thinking that somewhere out there, beyond that wall, the galaxy was going about its life, confident that humanity had long since turned to dust in its grave. But we didn't die. We became stronger, smarter, and more dangerous. And with every generation, the certainty grew. Sooner or later, we would get out of here. And then those who condemned us to death would realize they made the biggest mistake in galactic history by locking up a predator that had learned to pick any lock. I was at the central command post when our sensors detected the first signs of the Tychosphere's destabilization. The energy lattice that had kept us locked away for 5,000 years began to flicker like a dying light bulb. I remember my breath hitching because we had spent the last 500 years trying to provoke exactly this. We had embedded thousands of quantum resonators into the barrier's structure, which gradually, year after year, shook the energy framework from within by using the sphere's own operating principles against it. The project's chief engineer was screaming coordinates into the microphone to all stations, demanding maximum activation of the resonators. And I saw on the monitors how thousands of units across the entire system, from Mercury's orbit to the Kuiper belt, lit up, sending a synchronized pulse directly into the heart of the barrier. 10 minutes later, the Tychosphere, a technology created to last millions of years, designed to function for eternity, simply went out. And for the first time in 5 millennia, humanity saw the real stars. We didn't wait for the galaxy to notice on its own that we had broken free. The very second the barrier fell, I activated a protocol our entire intelligence network had been working on for the last 2 centuries. A scanner beam using folded space technology shot out of the solar system and, within seconds, covered 1,000 light-years in every direction, instantly mapping every planet, every station, and every ship in this sector of the galaxy. Data streamed onto our screens. Civilizations we had only read about in ancient archives still existed. Their cities, their fleets, their trade routes were all laid bare before us. Then, I launched the second part of the protocol, a broadcast message in 10,000 languages, including those no one had spoken for the last 3,000 years, because we had studied everything we could find in the pre-quarantine records. The text was simple and cold. I had written it myself. Humanity is here. We remember. We survived your grave. And now, we want to talk. An hour after the message, I gave the order for the first fleet to deploy. It was the moment hundreds of generations of my ancestors had lived and died for. the moment when humanity finally showed the galaxy what it had become during 5 millennia of forced isolation. Our ships began to emerge from exit points in folded space, and these were not the primitive rockets my ancestors had once flown to the Kadara. These were 100-kilometer-long leviathans with hulls forged from matter existing simultaneously in multiple dimensions and engines that literally devoured space to create local distortions in reality. Each ship was accompanied by a swarm of trillions of microscopic combat drones capable of acting as a single mind, and this entire armada moved with such synchronicity and precision that even I, the man who had planned this operation for years, felt uneasy, realizing the extent of our own power. I switched the monitors to intercepted conclave communication channels, and it was absolute chaos. Their sensors were picking up our emergence. Their analysts were trying to understand our ship's energy signatures and failing because we used technologies that simply didn't exist for them. Their military leaders were screaming for immediate fleet mobilization, and politicians were demanding emergency meetings. One intercepted conversation stood out. An ancient architect named Zental, one of those who had designed the Tychosphere 5,000 years ago, kept repeating over and over that this was impossible, that the barrier's energy should have lasted 1,000,000 years, and that no civilization could have broken it from the inside in such a short time. I smirked as I listened to his bewildered voice, thinking they had made a classic mistake. They hadn't underestimated our strength or our technology. They had underestimated human stubbornness, our ability to turn the impossible into reality when we are told we have to die. I was part of the interception team that broadcast the Conclave's emergency session in real time directly to our command center. And I must admit, watching the panic of those who had cold-bloodedly sentenced us to death 5,000 years ago was a strangely satisfying sight. Thousands of representatives from across the galaxy had gathered in their main hall, beings of the most incredible forms, from sentient gas clouds to crystalline structures glowing with their own intelligence, and they were all talking at once, their voices merging into a cacophony of fear and confusion. Our linguistic AI translated everything in real time, and I heard the same questions over and over. How is this possible? How did they survive? How did they break the barrier? What are they going to do next? Zental, that same ancient architect who had once locked us in a cage, stood in the center of the hall, projecting holograms of our ships, trying to explain to the others the scale of the catastrophe they had all blundered into. The scans of our technology provoked something between awe and terror among those gathered. Their analysts couldn't comprehend the operational principles of our spatial distortion engines, our energy signatures didn't match any physical model known to them, and our drone swarm control system demonstrated a level of quantum computing the Conclave hadn't reached even in theory. I saw one of their military advisors, a representative of a race with 6 limbs and bioluminescent skin, literally turn green with fear when Zental showed the energy output of just one of our ships. It was equivalent to their entire planetary fleet combined. Then, a young diplomat from the Cretan race, a being with avian features and surprisingly human eyes, spoke up and asked a question that silenced the entire hall. "What if we just apologize?" A few elders laughed, but their laughter sounded forced and nervous because everyone understood that an apology for genocide and 5,000 years of imprisonment sounded rather pathetic. The military faction demanded an immediate preemptive strike. Their Grand Admiral, a massive creature in an exoskeleton, argued that while humanity had not yet deployed its full power, they should assemble a combined fleet of all conclave races and deliver a crushing blow to the solar system before it was too late. I felt our entire command center tense up, hands reaching for buttons to activate defensive protocols. But Zental raised his ancient hand, and his voice cut through the noise. He said they were missing the main point. The barrier didn't just fall on its own, the humans broke it from the inside. They had hacked a technology his race had taken millions of years to create, and that meant only one thing. Humanity hadn't just survived, it had evolved to a level that made any military operation against them suicidal. A heavy silence hung in the hall, and I could almost feel the realization dawning on them. They had created a monster themselves by locking us in conditions where the only way out was to become stronger than gods. One of the representatives of the oldest race, beings who remembered the times before the conclave was even formed, spoke the words of an ancient prophecy. "Do not cage a predator smarter than you, for it will learn to pick the locks, and then you will become the prey." These words echoed through the hall, and I saw the faces of those gathered change as fear turned into something deeper, an understanding of their own mistake that had lasted 5 millennia. In the end, they voted. Send a delegation, establish contact, find out what the humans want, and pray to all their gods that it isn't revenge. When the broadcast ended, I leaned back in my chair and looked at my colleagues in the command center. We all understood that the next few days would determine the fate of the galaxy, and that the choice was now in our hands, to become the monsters they thought we were, or to prove that humanity is capable of being something more than just surviving prisoners thirsty for blood. I was an advisor to Admiral Chen when we were choosing the location for the first meeting with the Conclave, and I was the one who suggested the Katara orbital station, that very same dead planet where everything had begun 5,000 years ago. The Admiral gave me a long look and then nodded, because she understood the symbolism of that choice. We spent 3 weeks restoring the old station that drifted in orbit of the dead world, turning it into a memorial. The walls were covered with holographic projections of the names of all 12 billion Katara. Each name glowed with a soft blue light, and as you walked through the corridors, it felt like passing through a forest of ghosts. I personally inspected every system on the station, every projector, and every detail, because I knew this wasn't just a meeting, it was a trial, and the setting had to remind everyone present of the price paid for this history. When the Conclave ships appeared on the scanners, I stood beside Admiral Chen in the main hall, surrounded by those glowing names, feeling history itself become a weapon. The Conclave delegation arrived in full, Zental and 20 other representatives from various races, and I saw their faces as they entered the hall and realized exactly where they were. I watched their confidence evaporate, replaced by something between shame and fear. They clearly expected to see savages, aggressive barbarians in crude armor, waving weapons and demanding blood, but instead, they were met by Admiral Cassandra Chen. She was a woman of the 7th generation after the quarantine, in a flawless dark blue military uniform with gold insignia. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her face held the calm of someone absolutely certain of her position. I stood a step behind her, watching the delegates slowly scan the hall and read the names on the walls. In their eyes, those who had eyes, I saw the realization that they hadn't come to a negotiation, but to a history lesson that humanity had been preparing for 5 millennia. Admiral Chen didn't waste time on pleasantries. She simply began to speak. Her voice was calm, almost soft, but every word fell like a hammer blow. She said that 5,000 years ago, humanity had killed an entire civilization out of ignorance, not knowing the consequences of its actions. And that was a sin we still carry today. Then she said, the Conclave had responded to that tragedy by locking us away to die in isolation, sentencing billions of innocent people who had nothing to do with that expedition to a slow death, and that we had forgotten neither our guilt nor your sentence. I watched Zental, the ancient architect, who started to open his mouth to say something in his defense, but Chen continued without letting him get a word in. She listed every generation that had been born and died behind the wall, every sacrifice, every suffering, and every incredible effort it took to turn a death sentence into a challenge we ultimately accepted and won. When Zental finally managed to speak, he tried to explain that it had been a necessity, that the Conclave had no other choice, and that the threat had been too great. But his voice sounded weak and uncertain against the backdrop of those glowing names on the walls. Admiral Chen smiled, and that smile was colder than the vacuum of space. She said, "You know, Over these millennia, we've learned a lot about ourselves and about you, and the main discovery was this. You didn't lock us away out of fear of our microbes or our aggression. You feared that we would become better than you, that we would surpass you. And guess what? You were absolutely right. I saw those words hit the delegation. Some representatives bowed their heads, while others clenched their limbs in what their races considered a gesture of surrender. In that moment, I realized we hadn't just won a negotiation, we had won a moral war that had lasted 5,000 years. Now the only question was how we would handle this victory. My name is Marcus Vane, and I was one of 3 cyborg infiltrators sent into the heart of the Conclave archives 3 days before the official meeting on the Katara station. My body was 70% nanotech implants capable of mimicking any known form of matter, and my consciousness was enhanced by a quantum processor that allowed me to process terabytes of information in seconds. Penetrating their security systems turned out to be easier than we expected, not because they were foolish, but because their technology was based on principles developed millions of years ago, when no one could imagine that someone would learn to manipulate quantum entanglement at the level of individual atoms. I literally dissolved into their networks, becoming part of the information flow, and in 18 hours of continuous work, I copied the contents of the sealed archives, documents the Conclave had hidden for 5,000 years, hoping they would never surface. What I discovered in those files made me stop for several minutes just to digest the information. 1 week after the tragedy on Katara, a top-secret high-level council had been convened, and the minutes of that meeting stated in black and white that Katara was merely a pretext for a decision they had already made in advance. The documents revealed that humanity had shown exponential technological and social growth in just 500 years of the space age, that our rate of development was 10 times higher than the average for any known race, and that if given another 1,000 years of free development, we would inevitably surpass them all and become the dominant force in the galaxy. The real threat wasn't in our microbes, it was in our potential, in our ability to adapt and grow faster than the ancient races could ever imagine. Katara wasn't a tragedy, it was an opportunity they used to justify what they had planned to do to us anyway. But the most shocking discovery was the files marked with the highest level of secrecy even within the secret council. The records showed that the Conclave knew about the biological vulnerability of the Katara months before the Prometheus arrived. Their intelligence had intercepted our preliminary biological scans and realized that contact would be fatal for that race. Instead of warning Captain Vasquez, they deliberately remained silent, watching as the tragedy unfolded and documenting every stage of the Katara extinction, only to later use that tragedy as a moral justification for the quarantine. It was a provocation, a coldly planned operation where 12 billion sentient beings were sacrificed simply to create a casus belli against humanity. I felt physically nauseous as I read the reports of their observers, who described the agony of the dying civilization with scientific meticulousness and discussed exactly how to use that footage for propaganda purposes. I immediately transmitted all the files to Admiral Chen, and 12 hours later, she broadcast them to the entire galaxy in a live feed. No censorship, no cuts, in 10,000 languages simultaneously. I sat in our command center and watched through intercepted communication channels as a shockwave rolled across the civilized worlds. Riots broke out almost instantly on hundreds of planets, especially among the so-called younger races, whom the Conclave had also kept under its guardianship for millennia, limiting their development under the pretext of protecting them from themselves. Now they realized it wasn't protection, but a prison for anyone who could one day challenge the hegemony of the ancients. The governments of several worlds fell within days. Conclave delegates fled planets under guard, and in the pan-galactic networks, humanity transformed from dangerous savages into a symbol of resistance against tyranny. Proof that no cage can hold those who refuse to give up, and that a lie, no matter how ancient, eventually comes to light. I commanded the Intercept Task Force when our sensors detected the activation of the Conclave's ancient weapons, resonance detonators, devices capable of triggering a chain reaction in a star's core and turning it into a supernova within hours. And they were aiming right at our sun. The conclave had fractured after the archives were published. Progressive races demanded immediate negotiations and an admission of guilt, while the conservative faction, led by military advisors from several ancient civilizations, decided that the only way to maintain their power was to destroy humanity at any cost, even if it meant breaking all of their own laws. They didn't officially declare war. It was a series of covert operations, a shadow war where each side tried to outplay the other, but I knew from the start they didn't have a chance, not because we were stronger, but because we thought differently. When the detonators entered our system disguised as meteorites, we didn't destroy them. We intercepted them, stripped them down to the molecular level in 48 hours, figured out how they worked, and repurposed them, turning weapons of mass destruction into next-generation engine prototypes. Their next attempt involved nanotechnological agents, trillions of microscopic machines programmed to sabotage our life support systems, introduced through the merchant ships of neutral races who didn't even suspect they were being used. I led the counter-operation, and I must admit, the first 24 hours were tense. The agents were incredibly complex, capable of adapting and bypassing our security systems. But the Conclave's problem was that they didn't know one vital thing about humanity. During 5,000 years of isolation, we had turned our own bodies into battlefields against pathogens, developing biotechnology to the point where our immune systems were a symbiosis of biology and nanotechnology. Every cell in our bodies was protected by an army of microscopic defenders. Their agents met resistance they never expected. Our nanotech didn't just repel the attack, it captured the enemy agents, reprogrammed them on the fly, and sent them back with new instructions, turning the Conclave's weapons into our spies and saboteurs. Every move they made was met with a counter-move, and with each failure, their panic grew. They tried to hack our communication networks with quantum viruses, and we used those viruses to create a new encryption protocol. They sent saboteurs to our stations, and we recruited them by showing them the truth about their own governments. They blocked trade routes, and we opened new ones using folded space technology they could only dream of. I remember a conversation our intelligence intercepted. Zental was speaking with someone from the military council, and for the first time in millennia, his voice held real terror. He said he finally realized what they had created by locking us in isolation. 5,000 years of evolution in conditions where the only alternative to adaptation was death had turned humanity into more than just a strong race. They had created a civilization that solved problems deemed unsolvable simply because we didn't have the right to fail, didn't have a backup plan, and didn't have the option to retreat. The climax came when I received orders to deploy the first fleet to the Conclave capital. It wasn't an attack, but a demonstration, and I commanded the operation that was meant to show the galaxy once and for all what we had become. We surrounded their central world, thousands of our ships forming a perfect sphere around the planet, and while their defense fleets feverishly prepared for a fight and politicians screamed in panic, we activated a project we had been working on for the last 200 years. A star began to form at the center of our formation, a real, full-scale star created artificially from compressed hydrogen and controlled thermonuclear fusion, held in place by magnetic fields so powerful they warped the surrounding space. I looked at the screens displaying the reactions of observers across the galaxy and saw the same shock on every face. Humanity had learned to create suns. We had reached a technological level that ancient races considered the domain of gods, and we did it not over millions of years of slow evolution, but in 5 millennia of desperate struggle for survival in a cage they had built for us themselves. I was the chief prosecutor at the tribunal that humanity demanded be convened following the demonstration of the artificial star, and my task wasn't to send someone to prison or seek executions. My task was to judge the very idea, the philosophy that allowed the ancient races to decide for others who was worthy of life and who was not. My name is Thomas Ahrens. I am 63 years old, and I spent half my life studying galactic law, preparing for this moment, knowing that one day humanity would emerge from its cage and demand answers. The tribunal met on a neutral station built specifically for this event, and was broadcast live to every inhabited world in the galaxy. Billions of beings watched as Zental and 23 other architects of the quarantine, representatives of the conclave's eldest races, took their seats before the court not as criminals, but as symbols of a system that had ruled the galaxy for tens of thousands of years. I opened the session with words I had rehearsed for years. We are not judging people. We are judging the right of some to decide the fate of others without their consent. The defense for the conclave was led by a race of philosopher liminari, beings of pure energy considered the greatest thinkers in the galaxy, and their lead counsel built his argument on cold logic. He argued that the decision to quarantine humanity was rational from the standpoint of maintaining galactic stability, that humans truly represented a threat with their exponential growth and unpredictability, and that they could not be controlled through standard diplomatic methods. He cited statistics and mathematical models showing that humanity, in 1,000 years of free development, could indeed have destabilized the existing order, and that the conclave simply did what any responsible ruler must do: eliminate the threat preemptively. His speech was persuasive, logical, and flawless in terms of formal rationality, and I saw some representatives of the old races nodding in agreement with his points. But then Admiral Chen took the floor, and the atmosphere in the hall shifted. Chen did not argue with the defense's logic. Instead, she agreed with it, saying that, yes, we truly could not be controlled, that we were and remain unpredictable, that our growth potential did indeed threaten their hegemony, and that from the perspective of preserving the existing order, their decision made sense. But then she asked a question that echoed through the hall. And who said the existing order was worth preserving? She spoke about how the conclave chose control over understanding, a prison over partnership, and fear over curiosity, and that this choice specifically revealed the true weakness of their system. They were so afraid of change that they preferred to kill 12 billion innocent Kitara and sentence humanity to death rather than try to find a way to coexist. I watched as her words hit their mark, as even some conservative delegates began to doubt the righteousness of their actions. The turning point was the testimony of a representative from the Vorkai race, a civilization the conclave had taken under its protection 20,000 years ago after they supposedly showed signs of aggressive expansion. An old Vorkai, over 1,000 years old, stood before the tribunal and spoke words I will never forget. He admitted that the conclave had halted their evolution, freezing their development at a specific level under the pretext of protecting them from themselves, that his race could have become something more, reached the stars, and evolved into new forms of existence, but instead they were kept in a state of eternal childhood, in a gilded cage where they were given toys but never allowed to grow up. After 3 weeks of hearings, the tribunal delivered its verdict. The conclave as an institution was dissolved, its place taken by the Federation of Equals, a new union where every race has a voice regardless of age or technological level, where decisions are made by consensus rather than the decrees of the ancients, and where humanity became not a leader, but a catalyst for change, living proof that no system is eternal and that freedom will always find a way through any wall. 50 years have passed since the tribunal, and I have returned to Ketara's orbit one last time. I am in my 80s now, my body held together mostly by medical implants and stubbornness. But I promised myself I would live to see the opening of the memorial, to see the moment this dead planet became alive again. I was one of the lead engineers on the terraforming project, spending 30 years of my life recreating the Kitara ecosystem based on archival data we found on the very station where the tragedy began 5,000 years ago. It was incredibly difficult work, We were literally resurrecting an entire biosphere from scratch, cloning extinct species from preserved DNA samples, restoring climate systems, and bringing back the atmosphere. Every time someone asked why we were wasting so many resources on a dead world, I gave the same answer. Because we have to. Because it is our fault. And because the only way to live with a sin is to try to fix it, even if a full recovery is impossible. The monument stood at the highest point of the main continent, overlooking vast forests and oceans that hadn't existed for 5 millennia. 2 massive statues, 50 meters high, facing each other across a small plaza. Captain Maria Vasquez was depicted at the moment of realizing her expedition had caused a genocide. Her face showed horror and despair, her hand reaching forward in a useless attempt to stop the unstoppable. Architect Zental stood opposite her, his ancient figure frozen in a gesture that, for his race, meant making a difficult decision. Between them, engraved on black stone in 10,000 languages, was the inscription, "Here we remember 2 sins, the ignorance that killed the innocent and the fear that birthed tyranny. Let the galaxy never forget either." I stood before this monument during the opening ceremony, surrounded by representatives from hundreds of races, feeling the weight of history pressing down on my shoulders harder than any gravity. Beside me stood Admiral Cassandra Chen, now an elderly woman with gray hair and a face lined by the years, but with eyes that still burned with the same fire as they had half a century ago on the station. She was speaking with a young representative of the Tarkan race, one of the civilizations that had only recently reached space and joined the Federation of Equals. The youth looked anxious, his bioluminescent skin flickering with shades of curiosity and confusion. He asked the question I had heard hundreds of times over the years from various beings. "Did you never think of just destroying them for what they did to you? For 5,000 years of imprisonment, for the attempt to erase humanity from history? Wouldn't revenge have been just after everything?" I saw Chen smile sadly, and in that smile was the wisdom gained from decades of hard decisions. She answered him quietly, but her words carried across the plaza through the broadcast. Yes, every day I thought about it. Every night I woke up with thoughts of revenge, of just retribution for the billions lost, for the stolen millennia, for the right to simply exist that was taken from us. But if we had chosen the path of revenge, if we had turned the galaxy into ash and blood, then the Tychosphere would have won. It would have turned us into the monsters they believed we were. It would have proven those who locked us away right. Instead, we chose the harder path, to prove we can be better, that humanity is capable of not just surviving and avenging, but of forgiving and building and remembering without hatred. I watched as the cameras pulled back, showing the entire planet from orbit, green, alive, surrounded by the ships of hundreds of races working together. Among them were ships bearing the emblem of Earth, not as a symbol of dominance, but as a reminder that freedom is always more precious than safety, that fear is the worst architect of the future, and that the greatest victory is not in defeating an enemy, but in refusing to become them.